And finally, question number 4. It's a little bit lengthy. What is the history of the synagogue? When did it get started? Why was it started? Seems to me that there was no authority for the synagogue in the Old Testament, but that Jesus and his apostles went to the synagogue, which seems to make it okay. So do we sometimes disallow what is actually okay, maybe like with a fellowship hall? Not saying that we should get one, this questioner says, just asking an honest question. That's a good question. It's a good question. So the history of the synagogue. The whole idea of the synagogue began, from what most scholars agree on, during the days of the Babylonian captivity. Before the Babylonian captivity, the temple was in Jerusalem. Before that, there was a tabernacle. They all were there for the worship. But from the time of Solomon until the destruction of the temple in the Babylonian captivity, the temple was where people came to worship. Now, in the Old Testament, you're talking worship, you're talking animal sacrifices and all of that. So it's not just going to church, it's actually offering up these animal sacrifices. And that was how it got started. Later on, after the Babylonian captivity, many of the Jews returned to Jerusalem, but many of them did not. From that time all the way into the first century, you can read about what's called the diaspora, the dispersion, the Jews who were scattered away from Jerusalem. Those are sometimes called Hellenistic Jews in the first century. Remember the widows, the Hellenistic widows in Acts chapter 6. They had been raised outside of Jerusalem in the Grecian world. That's what Hellenized means. It was a Grecian world. They were raised out there in the diaspora. Well, throughout the diaspora, throughout the dispersion, Jews in various locations from Babylon all the way to Rome and all those little towns in between, when there was a group of Jews, they would set up a synagogue. It's important to note that that synagogue did not serve the function of worship in the sense that the temple did back in Jerusalem. There was no animal sacrifices made in the synagogue. Those were rather places where people could gather to hear the Torah being read, the law of Moses being read, where they could teach one another and so forth. We can say, I believe with complete confidence, that the use of the synagogue, even in the time of Jesus, was authorized. Our questioner says, they think, it seems like they didn't really have authority for that. I believe they did have authority for the synagogue. But we can say with complete confidence they did, because Jesus would not have participated if it had been a sinful, unlawful thing. Jesus would have never participated in that which is unlawful, which was sinful, which was unauthorized. He would not have participated in that. The very fact that he did participate in it is kind of indirect proof that it certainly had a lawful function. The question of, how was it authorized? Where was the authority for the synagogue? Well, this, of course, leads to that discussion of specific and generic authority. We've had this conversation in this auditorium before. Don't pull your hair out. I know it gets kind of crazy sometimes, but generic and specific authority. And again, I know some of you are thinking, preacher, where do you even get that stuff? I don't read anything in the Bible about generic authority, specific authority. Don't read anything in the Bible about that stuff. And I know you don't, because it's not specifically a biblical concept. It is a communication concept. Just like you don't read about mathematical equations in the Bible, but math sometimes comes in handy. Just ask Noah. Sometimes you got to do math, right? And so not specifically a biblical concept, but it certainly has biblical implications. Specific and generic authority, as it relates to communication, has to do with somebody communicating to somebody else. One person is in an authoritative position. They're trying to communicate a command, something they want accomplished, to somebody who's responsible for doing this thing. That's generic and specific authority. I mean, if God's talking to us, as he does in his word, we can utilize the principles of generic and specific authority. When you drive through McDonald's, You utilize the principles of generic and specific authority. Jared and I drove through a McDonald's the other day. I ordered a senior coffee. Don't laugh, it's cheap, and it's just the right amount. I ordered a senior coffee with 3 creams. You know what comes out? A large coffee with 3 cream. Now let me tell you, 3 creams work fine in a senior coffee. 3 creams in a large coffee, it don't work so well. You can't even taste the cream. Why would I have ordered that? The person on the other end wasn't paying attention. I specified senior coffee, that means a little one, with 3 creams. That's not what I got. Was I happy? I was not happy. Did I murmur and complain? Not too much, I don't think. And so, we went on, and I drank the big coffee that was all nasty and all that. But that illustrates specific and generic authority. This is not complicated stuff. It's not complicated. We use specific and generic authority almost every day of our lives. I hope we understand that. Is there specific authority for the synagogue? Can you show me a passage in the Old Testament where the Jews were commanded to build a synagogue? Can't show you that. There is no specific authority for senior coffee and 3 creams. You're not going to find that here, okay? What you do find in the Old Testament, specific commands for the Levites especially to be involved in the teaching of the people. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 10, the Levites are to teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. That's God's rules, God's law. The Levites were charged to teach them that. Later on in the days of Jehoshaphat, good king of Judah, 2 Chronicles chapter 17 and verse 9, Jehoshaphat sent out the Levites who taught Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with them. They went about through all the cities of Judah, and they taught among the people. Or how about Nehemiah in the days of the restoration, the Old Testament restoration? Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 5. Ezra opened the book in the sight of the law, or in the sight of the people, for he was above all the people. He opened it, and all the people stood up at the reading of the law. The Levites helped, this is verse 7, the Levites helped the people to understand the law. Verse 8, they read from the book, from the law of God clearly. They gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Specific command, Levites teach the people. You make it happen. You go out throughout the land of Judah, and you teach the people the law of God. That's why there were 48 Levitical cities, because God wanted his word to be taught from the top to the bottom, from the northern end to the southern end of the kingdom. That was the specific command. Generic authority has to do with how do you carry out that command. In the case of McDonald's, I happened to get a cardboard cup. That's what they do them in these days. I would have been perfectly happy with a styrofoam cup, but I didn't care. How I got the coffee didn't matter to me. And so I left that up to the people at McDonald's, and so I got the paper cup. I was fine with that. That's generic authority. Now, if I cared, I would have told them I want a paper cup. Styrofoam's going to kill us all. And so, I could have told them that, and I would have demanded my paper cup. I want my coffee in a paper cup, small size, 3 cream. Okay? Some of that is specific. Some of this is generic. Doesn't really matter. How do you go about teaching, which is the specific command? Well, again, the synagogue was the method, the expedient, if you want to use that word, the generic authority to carry out or to accomplish the specific duty of teaching. Again, it was never used as a place of sacrifice. That would have been sin, because it was specifically mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 12, you go to the place that God shall appoint, and that was Jerusalem. There's no record of any synagogue ever being the place of worship or of sacrifice. There's no record of that ever taking place in history. Now, the questioner again goes on to say, well, do we sometimes disallow what is actually okay? I have no doubt. Sometimes we disallow what is actually okay. That is, we draw the lines closer in fellowship than what we really should. I mean, the Pharisees did that, and Jesus condemned them for that. Mark chapter 7, verse 2, the Pharisees saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. You're eating with unwashed hands? Because the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly. Holding to what? To the law of Moses? No. Holding to the tradition of the elders. They drew a line closer than the law of Moses did. And it goes on to describe a lot of different areas where they did that. The Pharisees were guilty of that, drawing lines closer than what God drew those lines. Romans chapter 14 gives you another example of a person who draws the lines too closely. Those first few verses of Romans chapter 14. Remember, the one who believes he may eat anything, meat's okay, and the other person who says, no, drawing the lines really close, you got to be a vegetarian. God says, I don't care which way you do it, but the person who draws the line really close, Paul says, don't you be judgmental. Don't you judge the person who eats the steak. Don't judge him because he's okay eating the meat. I have said it's okay. You see that? So how does that apply to you and to me? Well, we don't want to draw lines that God did not draw. That's a fact. Sometimes because of our tradition, the way we were raised, or the dreaded, we've always done it that way. You've heard that one? If that's our authority for doing what we do, yeah, we might want to examine why we do what we do. In the case of the fellowship hall, can I just ask a simple question? Where's the authority for using money that's contributed on the first day of the week to build a fellowship hall? Are we, number one, if we talk about specific authority, is there a command that commands us to do that? You all know the answer to that. There is no specific command that tells us that we must build a fellowship hall. There is not one. So we can take specific command off the table. There's not one for that. But what about generic command? Is the fellowship hall accomplishing some generic thing? Is it an expedient to accomplishing something that is specified? Well, if it is, I guess the question would be, what would that be? What is it that we are commanded to do where the fellowship hall becomes an expedient to do that? I mean, we know what the Bible says is the work of the church, and so we have what? We have the teaching of the gospel, proclamation of the gospel, both to members of the church, that's called edification, and to those outside, that's called evangelism. And we know that the mission of the church is to take care of needy saints. Where does the fellowship hall expedite any of that? I believe this building is a fellowship hall because it expedites the teaching of the Word of God. If you want something similar to the synagogue, I believe the building, this is how, brethren, in this day and time, at least in our culture, it's how we go about expediting the command to teach, to spread the gospel. But if the fellowship hall is expediting some specific command, we got to know what that command is. And if it's not expediting some command, something we're specified to do, then there is no way to justify it. There's no way that we can justify the building of a fellowship hall. Somebody might say, well, preacher, it's all about the love. It's about loving one another. Well, can I remind you what 1 Corinthians 13 says about love? Here's what love looks like. Here's what love looks like. Love is long-suffering. I'm trying to fit a fellowship hall in here somewhere. Love is long-suffering. It is kind. It does not envy. It does not vaunt itself. It is not puffed up and proud. It does not behave itself in an unseemly way. Love is not self-seeking. It is not provoked. It thinks no evil, does not rejoice in lawlessness. No, love rejoices in the truth. That's the biblical picture of what love looks like. on the horizontal plane, one to another. And for the life of me, I don't see where the fellowship hall expedites any of that. And so the question is, where would the authority for that be? That's the abbreviated version. I think we've preached sermons on that before, but I hope that helps to answer the question.